Good morning. You can be opening your Bibles to the book of Numbers. And happy Mother's Day to all the mothers who are here. Samantha, unfortunately, is at home with some sick kids. So be praying for Hannah and Samantha and Elliot. I think they'll be fine, just a stomach thing or something. Just a heads up about next Sunday night. Dylan has been in the training program for a year now, and I've begun talking with guys who would like to be in the program once Dylan is done. And so next Sunday night, there's going to be a guy visiting with him and his wife from Saturday till Wednesday. And we're going to try to get to know each other a little bit, see if maybe he would be a good guy for the program after Dylan is done. So he will be preaching next Sunday night, Lord willing, for us, just so we can all get a little exposure to him and get to know him a little bit as a possibility. And so be looking forward to that. One of the burdens that I think we all have as Christians, and if you were in the Nehemiah class this morning, we talked about some of these kinds of ideas, is that we have the challenge of coming to understand in a greater way what it is that the Lord has done for us. I think a lot of the problems that we have stem from a lack of appreciation for God's blessings in our life, and we sometimes struggle to understand just how good God has been to us. And I want us to understand this from another perspective this morning by looking at some things in the book of Numbers and ultimately how Jesus is the fulfillment of these ideas. But I want to begin by looking at this passage here in Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 and verse 18. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, that's Moses talking, from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is giving his final 3 speeches to the people of Israel, the new generation that has risen up in the wilderness during the time of the book of Numbers, which we'll look at in just a moment. And as he's giving his final speeches to these people, he's letting them know there's going to come a time in our future where the Lord is going to raise up somebody from amongst us who's going to be like me, like Moses. And when this guy comes, you have to listen to everything that he says. And we would understand that prophet ultimately to be Jesus. But can you imagine the anticipation people would have after Moses said this? You know, the next guy is Joshua. And you remember that time when Moses was at the burning bush and he was supposed to remove the sandals from his feet. And then Joshua has a similar experience in the book of Joshua chapter 5 when he meets the commander of the Lord's army and he's meeting the Lord, an angel of the Lord, something like that. And then you telescope throughout Old Testament history, and as Jewish people wondering, is this the guy? Is this the guy? Until finally Jesus comes. In what ways is Jesus like Moses? Both of them were prophets. God gave them the words to speak. Both of them were involved in miraculous things. The first miraculous thing in one sense that Moses does is turning the water to blood. What's the first miracle that Jesus does? Turning water to wine. Jesus is the one that comes to bring blessings. Both of them were shepherds. Moses was literally a shepherd of sheep for about 40 years. Jesus is the good shepherd that lays down his life for the sheep. Both Moses and Jesus were spared at an early age, when the babies were being thrown into the river. And Jesus, when he was 2 or under, somewhere in that age range, when Herod was wanting to have all of those children executed. But one of the big similarities between Moses and Jesus that I want to talk about in this lesson is that they were both intercessors. And when you think about the intercessory work of Moses, the times where he would pray for the Israelites, maybe the biggest scene that comes to your mind is Exodus 32, when they make the golden calf. And that's certainly a great moment where you see the intercession of Moses. But I want us to think about the intercession of Moses from the book of Numbers. I think this is a neglected component to the book of Numbers, and we see this theme come out even more in the book of Numbers than perhaps we do in that time in Exodus. So have your Bibles opened to the book of Numbers, and we're going to look at that in just a moment. But I just want to set the context a little bit for what we're looking at right now. In the book of Numbers, the first 10 chapters is nothing but obedience by the nation of Israel. And we remember the book of Numbers not for their obedience, but for their disobedience. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, the famous chapter of the Hall of Faith, it goes basically chronologically throughout Old Testament history and people that were faithful. And Hebrews 11:29 talks about the faithful people that crossed the Red Sea. And then verse 30, the next verse talks about by faith the walls of Jericho fell down when they circled it 13 times total. So between Hebrews 11:29 and 11:30, which book of the Bible is skipped? It's the book of Numbers. Because we don't remember these people as being very faithful. But what were the kinds of things that they obeyed in the first 10 chapters of Numbers? Well, they numbered the people. 603,550 people. They numbered them all, and they did what they were supposed to do there. They arranged the camp in the right way, where God is at the center of the camp, and God needs to be the center of our life. And then you've got 3 tribes on the east side, 3 on the south side, 3 on the west side, 3 on the north side. They organize it all exactly like God commands them to. And these passages here, 154 and 234, are the verses that say they did everything that they were commanded to do. They got the lepers. Hey, you got leprosy, get outside the camp. They took the Passover for the first time after having literally been delivered from Egypt. They kept the Passover in chapter 9, verse 5, doing all of these things that God told them to do. Now, do you notice a similarity between these instructions? These are all the kinds of commandments that you can check mark, that you can know if you've done them or not. And by the way, does God give us commands that are check markable? He does. It would be good to know if God says, number the people, we have done it. Are there things that God has commanded us today that we can know if we've done it? Yeah. Have you been baptized into Christ? Yes or no. That's a yes or no kind of thing. It's not a spectrum kind of question. And so in the first 10 chapters, they're doing everything that God has commanded them to do. I remember when I was a newer Christian hearing sermons from time to time on authority. And we got Nadab and Abihu, and you got Uzzah moving the ark, and we've got to do everything according to what God says, and I agree with that. But what I hear a lot of times in discussions and sermons and Bible classes on authority is that the application is oftentimes just for the commands that are check markable. Baptism, using the Lord's Supper, or taking the Lord's Supper every Sunday, using the collection the right way. All of those things I agree with, believe, all that sort of thing. But if we really cared about authority, would we apply it to the commands that are harder to measure as well? In the book of Numbers, they excelled at check-markable commands. And thank God He's given us check-markable commands, because then we can know if we've done them or not. That's great. But you know what we can sometimes do? We can be really good at the things that we can measure, and then the things that are less measurable, not work on like we need to. In the book of Numbers, what is the sin that they start struggling with around chapters 11 through 21? It's grumbling, it's complaining, it's having an unauthorized attitude, if I can say it that way. What is grumbling and complaining? And by the way, there's some passages that show that 1 Corinthians 10, verses 9 and 10, we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Or in Numbers 14:27, the book that we're looking at this morning, how long shall this wicked generation grumble against me? I've heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, which they grumble against me. Just complaining constantly. What does it mean to complain? The expression of dissatisfaction and annoyance, discontentment, bitterness, envy, impatience, a lack of showing thankfulness to the Lord, thinking that you know better what the circumstances of your life ought to be. How would you know if you're a grumbler? Well, if you're talking to people all the time rather than expressing your frustrations to the Lord, if your sense of complaining has drowned out any sense of thankfulness and gratitude that you have, if you're complaining to people that can never help you find a solution, and anytime somebody tries to help you find a solution, you get really frustrated with that person. Now, this is what's happening in Numbers 11 through 21. They begin the book with great obedience, and then it just falls apart when it comes to the things that are less measurable. I'm going to show you a chart on the next slide, and I'm going to keep this chart up for a while because charts sometimes can be confusing. I don't know if in your mind, in my mind, the book of Numbers, especially chapters 11 through 21, this is where we have the 40 years of wilderness wandering. This section in the book of Numbers for a long time was always very muddy in my mind, and I didn't know how to keep the details of anything clear until I started realizing that there's a structure to this section. In Numbers 11 through 21, there are a series of 7 complaints that the Israelites make. And they have a parallel structure to them so that they begin and end with them complaining about their misfortunes and God doing something with fire. And then Moses intercedes. The second to the last one, they're complaining about sustenance, food and water. And in both of those cases, Moses fails to intercede. The third to the last one, they're complaining about the leadership. And in both of those cases, Moses and Aaron properly intercede. And then the middle one is them complaining about the giants in the land. They're too intimidating. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. We can't take the land. And Moses intercedes for them there. Now, why is it the case, and this kind of structure, by the way, like this inverted parallel structure, is used all over the place in the Old Testament. Why is that the case? Why would the Holy Spirit want things recorded in that way? Because back then, they didn't have book, chapter numbers, and verse numbers. But what they would do is they would memorize sections by seeing the parallel structure of those sections. I want to just highlight a few of these. We're not going to look at all of these. But I just want to look at some of the times where their attitude wasn't what it needed to be. They've moved beyond the check-markable commands, and now their attitude is not what it should be. Look at Numbers chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, in this first complaint that they make here. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of the place was Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Try to imagine this. These people are camping. They've been 3 days into their camping trip. Have you ever gone camping and never complained? What kinds of complaints do people make when they're camping? Oh, it rained and I don't like the rain and there's a lot of mosquitoes and the food's just not as good as, we didn't catch any fish today, so now we have to eat this canned stuff and it's not very good. And so God, when these people are complaining, he thinks it's justified to send fire. And it consumes some of the outlying parts of the camp. You notice that the people's anger is kindled, or the people's complaining causes God's anger to be kindled, and then he kindles a fire, as if the fire is a visual representation of God's anger. But at the same time, what does complaining do? Complaining spreads amongst people. You ever been in a work environment where everybody one person starts complaining and then everybody's starting to do it? Kind of spreads like fire does. When it says that it consumed some of the outlying parts of the camp, I don't take it to mean that just some of the tents were destroyed. I take it to mean that literally some of the Israelites were consumed by the fire. Can you imagine what it would be like if every time you started to complain, if God set part of your house on fire? Or you're driving in your car and you started complaining about something and suddenly your engine just caught on fire. How many cars would you have gone through in a year? Look over at Numbers chapter 21. I want us to see the last one here where God does something with fire. Look at Numbers 21. We're not going to read all of this, but look at Numbers 21, verses 5 through 7. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. By the way, do you notice just how much their complaints don't make sense? There's no food and water, and we hate the food and water that you're giving us. Sounds like you got food and water. Look at verse 6. Then the Lord sent the fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. And the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people. Okay, now try to imagine this. You got more misfortunes. There's things in your life that you're really frustrated with. You're not happy right now. And then boom, fiery serpents. I don't think that means that the serpents miraculously had inflamed backs or something. I think it means that if they bit you, the sensation it would give you would be a fiery kind of sensation. Can you imagine next time you're typing something, some angry text, or you're typing something on social media about and then suddenly, like out of your phone or out of your computer keyboards came little serpents that started biting your hands? Can you imagine that? In this last one, ask yourself the question, where would the nation of Israel be without Moses? Because in both instances, when they're struggling with their attitudes, Moses prays and the fire calms down. Or Moses sets up this bronze serpent and the people can look at it and they can be healed. Where would the nation of Israel be without Moses? And then you can think about the third to the last one. When they're complaining about the leadership of the people, you got Miriam and Aaron saying, how come it is that Moses is the special one, and then she gets leprosy and Moses intercedes for her? Or what about Korah's rebellion? You got a bunch of guys that want to be head honcho, and they got all these concerns and complaints about why is it that the priests and the Levites are the priests are the ones that get to go before the Lord, and then the earth swallows them up. Do you realize that God thinks it's reasonable and justified when people complain to bite them with fiery serpents? And when people complain about leadership, God thinks it's justified to strike somebody with leprosy. And when people complain about leadership in another context, it's justified, it makes sense, it's not over the top to open up the earth and swallow those complainers. Do you realize the God that we serve and how holy He is? This is the same God who had people struck for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. Look at this middle one. Go to Numbers 14. This middle one where the promised land is just too intimidating. Look at Numbers 14, verse 3. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. And if you were in the Nehemiah class this morning, they did indeed choose a leader. We don't necessarily read about who that is there. But they've decided we're going to go back. This land is too terrible. There's no way that we're going to be able to make it, and our little ones are going to become prey. Ironically, it's the little ones who end up making the Canaanites prey. This causes God to tell Moses, I'm done with these people. Look at Moses' prayer for them down in Numbers 14, verses 19 and 20. Moses says, please pardon the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word. Now they're still going to be sentenced to an extra 38 years in the wilderness. They've already been in the wilderness for 2 years. They're sentenced to more time, but those extra time in the wilderness, that is less worse than what they deserved. Ask yourself the question again. When God says in verse 20, I have pardoned according to your word, Moses, where would the nation of Israel be without Moses? Do you see where we're going in this lesson? All these times, the people constantly having bad attitudes, constantly handling hardship with a lack of faith, not trusting that God is orchestrating their circumstances, and asking themselves the question, what is it that we might be able to learn right now? No, they're not asking questions like that. Instead, it's just, God doesn't know what he's doing, and I don't know why this is happening, and I'm bitter and I'm frustrated all the time. And then here's Moses keeping these people alive. You know, the New Testament says this in Hebrews 7:25. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. I forget what translations it is, but in the ESV it says he always lives. There's some versions that say he ever lives to make intercession for them. Do you know what that means? That in the heavenly realm, this prophet that eventually came and was like Moses, but in a much greater way, that this prophet who came, he ever lives. Moses dies. We're going to look at Numbers 20 in just a moment, so be turning your Bible there and keep it there for a second. But if Jesus ever lives to make intercession for us, do you know what that means? I ever need? What is it that I always need? I always need his intercessory work. There's never a point where I become so mature in the Lord that he just doesn't have to, keep interceding for me. It's not like Jesus is in the heavenly realm and he goes, well, so-and-so has just become so mature, I don't really have to intercede for them anymore. He ever lives to make intercession for us, which means we constantly need his interceding. Of all of the Old Testament books, which one most parallels the life of the Christian? Is it the book of Exodus? Well, not really, because we were enslaved, but we were delivered through the water. And maybe it's the book of Numbers, because we're the ones now wandering in the wilderness on our way to the promised land, and we've got a lot of warnings to learn from the book of Numbers. Warnings that the New Testament would echo, like Philippians 2:14 and 15, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Samantha and I, after the kids went to bed last night, we sat out at the front porch hoping to see the Aurora Borealis, which, because we're from Minnesota, we had seen that kind of thing before. But the pictures were really cool. And we sat out front, and when the sun had set, and we were looking up, and we started to see some of the first stars of the night. The imagery in this passage is that if you don't complain, you're going to shine as lights in a dark world. Notice it doesn't just say, if you do all the things that are measurable, you'll shine as lights in a dark place. No, you got to do the things that are measurable, but how about we do the things that are harder to measure too? How about you stop complaining? What kinds of things could we complain about that require intercession? What about complaints about our misfortunes? How often do you complain about your misfortunes? I don't like the state of the nation. I don't like this. I don't like that. I don't know why this is happening. Car problems again. This, the food that we're eating. Nothing tastes good anymore. Blah, 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 blah. Do you realize that something that is that benign literally requires the intercession of Jesus? Do you realize that? What about complaints about leaders? It just feels so natural to complain about leaders and just have a really bitter attitude. Never pray for them, but we're going to complain about them all the time. Do you realize that requires the intercession of Jesus? We don't look at those kinds of... We think about the intercession of Jesus as if I get drunk, or I commit sexual sin, or I watched porn, or I punched somebody in the face or something like that. That's where it requires intercession. But do you see how much more intercession we need? What about complaints about the giants? Oh, those giants in the land, they're really big. We can't take the promised land. We can have mindsets that say, I could never change that sin. It's so ingrained in me. I could never reach this person with the gospel. I don't know how to answer their questions. And we just complain, and we don't have a good attitude about doing the things that God has asked us to do. And then Revelation 21 verse 8 says, but as for the cowardly, the faithless, and he goes on to list more sins, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. You're in the wilderness, waiting for the promised land, and you just keep telling yourself, I can't overcome that sin. I can't do this big thing that God has asked. Yeah, of course you can't on your own strength, but if you rely on the Lord, he can help you. You realize every time we complain about the giants, that also requires intercession? Look at this passage in Numbers chapter 20 when Moses fails to intercede. There's 2 times in the book of Numbers where Moses fails to intercede. The first time was in chapter 11, but I want us to look at this last time. Look at Numbers chapter 20, starting in verse 10. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy." Can you imagine why Moses would be losing composure? 2 or 3 million people in the wilderness. I've had to put up with you guys. I'd rather just deal with literal sheep. And you guys are complaining again and again and again, and God tells me to speak to this rock. I'm going to take the rock, and I'm going to strike it twice. I did that. I struck a rock earlier when we first came into the wilderness and water came from it. God's told me to speak to it this time, but I'm going to go ahead and strike it twice, and water comes gushing out of it. But he didn't uphold the Lord as holy. And so even in this moment when Moses fails to intercede like he needs to, God is still showing his mercy to the people despite that. But here's Moses losing his composure. Have you realized this before? That when you read the Gospels, you're reading about God become man, which means every sin anybody's ever committed is ultimately against Jesus. Can you imagine being Jesus, and you're in Peter's house having a Bible study, and you can look out at every single person, and every single evil thought they've ever had, every single evil action they've ever done that they've tried to hide from people, all of them ultimately against you. Can you imagine Jesus with the 12 apostles? Every sin they ever committed was ultimately against him. Have you ever been in a room with people, and there's 5 people that have sinned against you? You think it's pretty easy to hold your composure? Not really. But here's Jesus coming into this world, keeping his composure, being greater than the great intercessor Moses, and doing his work so that we can be people who are blessed and forgiven and can be with him forever. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, it says, "For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." What did Moses do to that rock for the water to come out? He struck it. What happened to Jesus when he was on the cross? He was struck, he was wounded, kept his composure, and from him blessings flow. Ask yourself the question where you would be without Jesus' intercession. Stop looking at it as something that just all those really bad sinners need, and realize that every time you do something as little as complain, Jesus had to die for that. Don't just think about the measurable instructions and be satisfied. Realize that Jesus' intercessory work applies to everything that we might do that doesn't accord with what he's asked of us, and look at the great mercy of the God that we follow. But take that mercy, absorb it, digest it, and let it change the way that you do everything. How appreciative are you of the one greater than Moses that we have? How much do you consciously realize that you need his interceding for you every single day? Do you have him interceding for you? Maybe you're not a Christian, and you've not done what the Bible says to become a Christian by repenting and being baptized. This is an opportunity for you to think about those things and ask yourself if your heart is right with God. Let the Scriptures help you figure that out. If you're here this morning, though, and you have been delivered from the Pharaoh at one point and you keep wanting to go back, stick with the greater Moses. Stick with Jesus. Let him keep interceding for you. Don't grow weary like we talked about last Sunday morning. We're about to sing this song, and it's intended to encourage all of us to think about the state of our soul. If there's anybody here that needs anything, don't leave here without talking to somebody, or the option is available right now to come forward while we stand and while we sing.